Sense and Sensibility is a novel by Jane Austen, published in 1811. It was published anonymously by a lady. Appears on the title page, where the author's name might have been. It tells the story of the Dashwood sisters, Elinor, age 19, and Marianne, age 16 and half. As they come of age, they have an older half-brother, John, and a younger sister, Margaret, 13. The novel follows the three Dashwood sisters, as they must move with their widowed mother from the estate on which they grew up, Norland Park, because Norland is passed down to John, the product of Mr. Dashwood's first marriage, and his young son. The four Dashwood women need to look for a new home. They have the opportunity to rent a modest home, Barton Cottage, on the property of a distant relative, Sir John Middleton. There they experience love, romance, and heartbreak. The novel is likely set in southwest England, London, and Sussex between 1792 and 1797. The novel, which sold out its first print run of 750 copies in the middle of 1813, marked a success for its author. It had a second print run later that year. It was the first Austen title to be republished in England after her death, and the first illustrated Austen produced in Britain. In Richard Bentley's standard novel series of 1833, the novel continued in publication throughout the 19th, 20th and early 21st centuries, and has many times been illustrated, excerpted, abridged, and adapted for stage and film. Plot summary: Henry Dashwood, his second wife, and their three daughters, lived for many years with Henry's wealthy bachelor uncle at Norland Park, a large country estate in Sussex. That uncle decides, in late life, to will the use and income only of his property first to Henry, then to Henry's first son, by his first marriage, John Dashwood, so that the property should pass intact to John's 3-year-old son Harry. The uncle dies, but Henry lives just a year after that, and he is unable in such short time to save enough money for his wife Mrs. Dashwood and their daughters, Elinor, Marianne, and Margaret, who are left only a small income. On his deathbed, Mr. Henry Dashwood extracts a promise from his son John to take care of his half-sisters. But before Henry is long in the grave, John's greedy wife, Fanny, persuades her husband to renege on the promise, appealing to his concerns about diminishing his own son Harry's inheritance, despite the fact that John is already independently wealthy, thanks to both his inheritance from his mother and his wife's dowry. Henry Dashwood's love for his second family is also used by Fanny to arouse her husband's jealousy and persuade him not to help his sisters financially. John and Fanny immediately move in as the new owners of Norland, while the Dashwood women are treated as unwelcome guests by a spiteful Fanny. Mrs. Dashwood seeks somewhere else to live. In the meantime, Fanny's brother, Edward Ferrars, visits Norland and is attracted to Elinor. Fanny disapproves of their budding romance and offends Mrs. Dashwood by implying that Elinor must be motivated by his expectations of coming into money. Mrs. Dashwood moves her family to Barton Cottage in Devonshire, near the home of her cousin, Sir John Middleton. Their new home is modest, but they are warmly received by Sir John and welcomed into local society, meeting his wife, Lady Middleton, his mother-in-law, the garrulous but well-meaning Mrs. Jennings, and his friend, Colonel Brandon. Colonel Brandon is attracted to Marianne, and Mrs. Jennings teases them about it. Marianne is not pleased, as she considers the 35-year-old Colonel Brandon an old bachelor, incapable of falling in love or inspiring love in anyone. While out for a walk, Marianne gets caught in the rain, slips, and sprains her ankle. The dashing John Willoughby sees the accident and assists her, picking her up and carrying her back to her home. After his rescue of her, Marianne quickly comes to admire his good looks and his similar tastes in poetry, music, art, and love. His attentions and Marianne's behavior lead Elinor and Mrs. Dashwood to suspect that the couple are secretly engaged. Elinor cautions Marianne against her unguarded conduct, but Marianne refuses to check her emotions. Willoughby engages in several intimate activities with Marianne, including taking her to see the home he expects to inherit one day and obtaining a lock of her hair. When an engagement, or at least the announcement of one, seems imminent, Mr. Willoughby instead informs the Dashwoods that his aunt, upon whom he is financially dependent, is sending him to London on business indefinitely. Marianne is distraught and abandons herself to her sorrow. Edward Ferrars pays a short visit to Barton Cottage, but seems unhappy. Elinor fears that he no longer has feelings for her, but she will not show her heartache. After Edward departs, Sisters Anne and Lucy Steele, vulgar cousins of Mrs. Jennings, come to stay at Barton Park. Lucy informs Elinor in confidence of her secret 4-year engagement to Edward Ferrars that started when he was studying with her uncle, and she displays proof of their intimacy. Elinor realizes Lucy's visit and revelations are the result of her jealousy and cunning calculation, and it helps Elinor to understand Edward's recent sadness and behavior towards her. She acquits Edward of blame and pities him for being held to a loveless engagement to Lucy by his sense of honor. Elinor and Marianne accompany Mrs. Jennings to London. On arriving, Marianne rashly writes several personal letters to Willoughby, which go unanswered. When they meet by chance at a dance, Willoughby is with another woman. He greets Marianne reluctantly and coldly. To her extreme distress, she leaves the party completely distraught. Soon Marianne receives a curt letter, enclosing their former correspondence and love tokens, including a lock of her hair. Willoughby is revealed to be engaged to a young lady, Miss Grey, who has a large fortune. Marianne is devastated. After Elinor reads the letter, Marianne admits to Elinor that she and Willoughby were never engaged. She behaved as if they were because she knew she loved him and thought that he loved her. As Marianne grieves, Colonel Brandon visits and reveals to Elinor that Willoughby seduced, impregnated, then abandoned Brandon's young ward, Miss Eliza Williams, Willoughby's aunt, subsequently disinherited him, and so, in great personal debt, he chose to marry Miss Grey for her money. Eliza is the illegitimate daughter of Brandon's first love, also called Eliza, a young woman who was his father's ward and an heiress. She was forced into an unhappy marriage to Brandon's elder brother in order to shore up the family's debts, and that marriage ended in scandal and divorce. While Brandon was abroad with the army, after Colonel Brandon's father and brother died, he inherited the family estate and returned to find Eliza dying in a pauper's home. So Brandon took charge of raising her young daughter. Brandon tells Elinor that Marianne strongly reminds him of the elder Eliza for her sincerity and sweet impulsiveness. Brandon removed the younger Eliza to the country and reveals to Elinor all of these details, in the hope that Marianne could get some consolation in discovering Willoughby's true character. Meanwhile, the Steele sisters have come to London as guests of Mrs. Jennings. After a brief acquaintance, they are asked to stay at John and Fanny Dashwood's London house. Lucy sees the invitation as a personal compliment, rather than what it is, a slight to Elinor and Marianne who, being family, should have received such an invitation first. Too talkative Anne Steele betrays Lucy's secret engagement to Edward Ferrars, Fanny's brother. As a result, the sisters are turned out of the house, and Edward is ordered by his wealthy mother to break off the engagement on pain of disinheritance. Edward, still sensitive of the dishonor of a broken engagement, and how it would reflect poorly on Lucy Steele, refuses to comply. He is immediately disinherited in favor of his brother, Robert, which gains him respect for his conduct and sympathy from Elinor and Marianne. Colonel Brandon shows his admiration by offering Edward the living, a clergyman's income, of the Delaford parsonage, so to enable him to marry Lucy. After he takes orders, Mrs. Jennings takes Elinor and Marianne to the country to visit her second daughter, Mrs. Charlotte Palmer, at her husband's estate, Cleveland. Marianne, still in misery over Willoughby's marriage, goes walking in the rain and becomes dangerously ill. She is diagnosed with putrid fever, and it is believed that her life is in danger. Elinor writes to Mrs. Dashwood to explain the gravity of the situation, and Colonel Brandon volunteers to go and bring Marianne's mother to Cleveland to be with her. In the night, Willoughby arrives and reveals to Elinor that his love for Marianne was genuine, and that losing her has made him miserable. He elicits Elinor's pity, because his choice has made him unhappy. But she is disgusted by the callous way in which he talks of Miss Williams and his own wife. He also reveals that his aunt said she would have forgiven him if he married Miss Williams, but that he had refused. Marianne recovers from her illness, and Elinor tells her of Willoughby's visit. Marianne realizes she could never have been happy with Willoughby's immoral, erratic, and inconsiderate ways. She values Elinor's more moderated conduct with Edward, and resolves to model herself after her courage and good sense. Edward later arrives and reveals that, after his disinheritance, Lucy jilted him in favor of his now wealthy younger brother, Robert. Elinor is overjoyed. Edward and Elinor marry, and later Marianne marries Colonel Brandon, having gradually come to love him. The two couples live as neighbors, with both sisters and husbands in harmony with each other. Willoughby considers Marianne as his ideal, but the narrator tells the reader not to suppose that he was never happy. End of the summary. Thank you.